On this episode of Narcissist Apocalypse, we talk with an abuse survivor named Anisha. And Anisha was married to an arrogant, victim-playing abuser. It's a story of the fixing belief, confusion, protecting the abuser, criticism, second abuse, and the healing process. Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and with me today we have Anisha. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you for being here, and if you want to be a guest like Anisha is today, please do go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, fill out our guest form, and we will go from there. Also at our website, we have a support group with Zoom meetings every Wednesday nights, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights. And we have forum boards for you to post on to get the validation you need from survivors just like you. That is all at narcissistapocalypse.com. And we do have a content warning for this episode as we do graphically discuss physical abuse in this episode. And today you're going to hear Anisha's story. And Anisha was married to her abuser through an introduced marriage, which is part of Indian culture. Everything looked good on paper. Things moved quickly. And after they were married, the abuse started immediately. And Anisha thought that she could fix the abuser. She wasn't seeing these things as abuse for a very long time, but there was no fixing of this abuser. He was not going to stop being abusive. And I know today that Anisha will validate so many of you out there. And I also hope that domestic violence agencies and clinicians are also listening to this story today as we do discuss abuse and retraumatization from those entities as well. So a big thank you to Anisha for being here. And now I'm going to get out of my way and your way. Anisha, the floor is now yours.
So my story pre-marriage and pre-meeting my abuser is not necessarily the typical story. I didn't come from any type of background of family violence or abuse or conflict. I'm Indian. My parents immigrated here to America from India when I was a year old and, just kind of lived the typical immigrant dream, tried to come here, build a family, build a life. We didn't have a lot of money starting out, but then my dad, as a doctor, was able to build a career and a practice for himself. And so I was just part of a very loving family with parents who just really wanted the best for me and my two younger sisters. We also lived in a generational home with my grandparents from India, visiting us off and on and staying with us for months at a time. And I think somewhere around being 12, 13 years old, they came to live with us full time. So I just kind of was raised in a very typical Indian household with multi-generations, grandparents living with us. My parents really strongly believed in education. And so I went to a private all-girls school, one of the top schools in our area or in the country. So I came from a very well-educated background. And one of the things that's kind of ironic is they actually really did emphasize domestic violence education and prevention in the school. So I felt like I was raised really believing in women's rights, fighting for women's rights. I felt like I knew what abuse was, even though the focus, I would say, in that education was really about physical violence and not really about verbal violence. And so I think that exposed me not knowing a lot about verbal abuse in that kind of education. And then I'd say if I have to really describe myself overall, I'm someone who is an optimist. I'm always seeing the best in people. I'm always trying to be a peacemaker in whatever situation I'm in with family or friends or whoever. And kind of my career path before getting married was the path of becoming a healer. So I had considered medical school, but didn't really feel like the right fit for me. And so my path as a healer was to study acupuncture, yoga therapy, meditation, all of those things I was very passionate about. I spent a lot of time invested in my training and my schooling with that. And I would say the first 27 years of my life, I lived a very blessed life, not only without trauma, but all the people in my life were just good, honest people that I would say would never want to hurt me. So I think this setup before going into marriage and what kind of set me up for abuse is I was extremely innocent. I was very naive. I was an optimist. And I was definitely just an idealist about life, about marriage. I really wanted a life partner who I felt was going to truly support me in terms of understanding my profession, my identity, my path. And so that's something that definitely made me vulnerable in hindsight.
So at this point, you become a very accomplished person. You become a doctor of Eastern medicine. And for all intents and purposes, your life is going smoothly, great in every way possible. And in your culture, there are sometimes arranged marriages. And you had something that was called an introduced marriage. So can you discuss the myths around arranged marriages and how these things work, and then your thought process on it as well?
So I want to clarify a little bit some of the nomenclature because arranged marriage is a system that's existed in India and other countries like that for centuries. It's a very old system that with even my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, I've seen how that has been evolving. So in my grandparents' generation, you may not get to meet the bride or groom till the day of the wedding. And you may have like no say in who the partner is going to be. So in that sense, it was completely arranged by parents or other family members that this marriage would be the best thing for both families, not necessarily the individuals, but for the families. In my parents' generation, that evolved a bit where you had more freedom and choice. So even with my parents' arranged marriage, they met several people before selecting each other as their top choice out of the other candidates. And neither of them were forced to marry each other, but out of meeting those candidates, they decided that this was the best choice for them, and their parents and families kind of supported that. So for me, being a second generation American, I did not think I was going to be open to arranged marriage. I wasn't really inclined on that path, but I was open to being introduced to other Indian men. And so the new terminology that's been used in my generation is introduced marriages, which is kind of like the concept we have of being set up on a blind date. Your friends might orchestrate it, you don't know that person. But with an introduced marriage, you're kind of going on that blind date with the intention to marry and to see, is this a person that I would consider marrying? So for me at age 27, I had just gone to graduate school in New Mexico, which is a more isolated part of the country back in the 1990s where there were not a lot of immigrants. And so I wasn't really meeting Indian men being in a state with a very small population without Indian men. And so I told my parents at that time that I was open to being introduced to other people and, met a bunch of people and nothing was really aligning. In terms of the Indian community, I feel like I'm a little bit more eccentric, like most Indian kids my age, friends all went to medical school, but I chose an alternative medical school, right? That was very different. And so I just found it hard to relate to some of these Indian men who had not been to India, didn't speak the language, weren't well versed in cultural things, didn't practice yoga themselves. And so when I did meet my husband, he checked a lot of boxes that previous candidates were not checking. So we were introduced by a family friend who knew his family for a long time, who knew my family for a long time. I met her at a friend's wedding, And she just casually said to me one day, "Would you like to be introduced to an Indian doctor who also practices acupuncture?" And he grew up in India, but he's been living here in the US for like a decade or so. And so I was very open to that. And I was like, that's kind of the best of both worlds. Someone who understands the Indian heritage, but also has lived in America and kind of understands what life is like here. So when she said that, she gave him my phone number. We spoke the next day for like 2 hours, I would say, and kind of hit it off right away. And I think this isn't just a cultural thing, but I think many people will say, have this experience when you meet someone and they're like perfect on paper. They have all these qualities that you were looking for, or some qualities you didn't even know you were looking for, but you're happy that they have them. So for me, the kind of the boxes that were getting ticked off were one, he was from India. He had grown up there and had strong cultural connection and values. He also is from the exact same city in India that I'm from, which is kind of rare when you're meeting other Indian people in this country. They could be from anywhere in the country, not necessarily the same state, not necessarily the same city. So that meant he spoke the same language as me, which I was really happy about. The fact that he was a doctor, I wasn't looking for someone to be a doctor because of the prestige of that. But for me, being a medical doctor, to have someone of that same background was helpful. And then the fact that he had studied acupuncture just meant to me that he wasn't a conventional, like closed-minded MD. He was someone who was open to studying other systems and techniques, which I really appreciated. And that was kind of rare for me to meet other Indian people who were in the medical field who were open, because back in the 1990s, acupuncture was not popular. It was not common. Some people had not heard of it. So that, really helped, I felt, make us a good match. And then he also claimed to be spiritual. I say claimed because that is something that's important to me. I define myself as a very spiritual person, not necessarily a religious one, but that's a huge part of who I am and how I identify. And so, he was religious, not like overly zealous religious, but he just, had his faith. He honored it, went to temples, went to ashrams, studied religious texts or religious teachers. And so that was something that just impressed me. And I felt like we had that commonality to us. So those were kind of all the things just with his background that made me feel like, okay, there's a real genuine possibility here of compatibility and the potential for a good marriage without knowing anything else about his personality, but just all the stuff you'd have on a resume, on a piece of paper. So we had that first initial phone call, 2 hours, really hit it off. Then we spent the next 2 weeks or so talking on the phone every day. And then we were able to meet in person after talking for 2 weeks on the phone. So we lived in different cities, but I went out to visit where he lived, met his sister, met his brother-in-law, connected with them one weekend. And then the following weekend, so we've known each other now for 3 weeks, he came out to visit my family. My parents loved him, thought it was a really good match. They weren't pressuring me, but they really felt very strongly that this was the perfect person for me. And at that 3-week mark, we ended up getting engaged. And there wasn't an official proposal where he got down on one knee, but he just told me very matter-of-factly, "You are the person that I want to marry. If you're not interested, I don't think I will ever get married, but you're kind of everything I've been looking for." So it's just kind of very matter of fact. And then the next day I told him very matter of factly as well that I was ready and wanted to move forward. And so the wedding date was set for 6 months from that time period. And so during those 6 months, we were still living in different cities, but I went one weekend to visit him and he came one weekend to visit me. So in those 6 months, I've met this person 4 weekends, right? And so it's very easy for an abuser to hide who they really are if you're not with them 24/7 and you're just seeing them in these small, short doses. So in those 2 weekends, while we were engaged that I visited him, there were a couple of red flags that popped up, and they were so quick, or they weren't like big incidences. And so there were things that just kind of threw me off or confused me, or I didn't know what to do with that information. And I kind of dismissed it and wrote it off. So there was definitely a sense of his temper flaring at one point and him being illogical. And in the conversation, I was trying to point out that's not logical. And he just kind of said, "You're really difficult or impossible to talk to," and kind of walked away. So that definitely threw me off. And after that, we reconciled very quickly because he just wanted to present himself in a good way again. And we didn't discuss that incident again. But kind of getting to know him during that time period, I definitely saw that he was extremely insecure. He had a strong need for approval. Some people who are insecure, could portray themselves as very arrogant. He had a sense of entitlement, and he always kind of played the victim. So he was always kind of just seeming like there was a dark cloud over his head, and he had these unique struggles in life that no one else had as hard a time as he did. So that was kind of just the stage that was being set. Real glimpses of who he was, but me not putting as much weight into those red flags and kind of dismissing them. So I essentially, you know, married a man I barely knew, but I just put a lot of faith and trust in the system, which completely set me up for the abusive marriage. The only other thing I would say I knew about him is that he was very close to his mom, who lived in India and who was a widow. And so this is another part of being a victim. He lost his father when he was 20 years old. And so I definitely felt compassion for their situation. I'm sure it was traumatic at the time, what they had to go through, but he's not the only person who's ever lost a parent. And many people who do that find a way to move on, or, even in my own family, it's not an uncommon story. But the way he portrayed these things is just he's the victim and no one else has suffered as much as he has suffered. So I also knew that him and his sister and his mother all put his father on a pedestal. And it just seemed like this man was like a saint who could do no wrong, which seemed a little fishy, but I didn't question it at the time. And then shortly after his father dying, he came to America to continue pursuing his medical career. So I think he had been in the country about a decade or so before I met him. And my other impression of him is that he was someone who just seemed lonely and isolated and didn't have many friends. He had admitted to me that he was bullied as a child, so he probably had a lot of insecurity from that situation. Found out he was also, as a young child, molested by a priest. So I think that's important to know about what set him up to be an abuser. And then his arrogant personalities, he was always just a big talker. He was always inflating himself, praising what a great doctor he is. That was just kind of like the way he normally talked. So that was not appealing to me. That was not attractive to me, but I didn't think of the boasting as like a red flag for abuse. It was just stuff that kind of threw me off. I hadn't been exposed to before. And I just kind of dismissed it as like, okay, this is who he is. And I just have to accept that and kind of work around that.
Hi, everyone. If you've been listening to Narcissist Apocalypse for a long time, you probably know I haven't done host read ads in years. And that's because all I really have with you is trust. So as time has gone on, I become more careful about what I bring to the show, especially because survivors deserve care from people who understand trauma and aren't treating it like some side issue. That's why I wanted to tell you about Rebound Therapy. Rebound offers specialized virtual treatment for people ready to work through past trauma and reclaim their lives. What stood out to me is that their therapists are carefully vetted and trained in evidence-based treatment. They pair their clinical expertise with deep support from survivor advocates who have lived experience to support your healing process between sessions. It's covered by many major insurance plans like Aetna, many Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, and more. Head to hellorebound.com/NA to check your insurance or get matched with a therapist. I'll also put the link in the episode description. So on paper here, this person is looking pretty perfect, I would say. The way the system is working, he's getting vouched for. Why would you think that a family friend doesn't have your best interest at heart? Your parents give the thumbs up and approve of him, and you also have choice in free will here. So things move fast, and when things move fast, that's never really good because you can't get to know the person as well as you want. Red flags are happening. There are some issues with his temper, but this gets dismissed and swept under the rug. He also likes to play the victim. He talks himself up. He's insecure, but he also has trauma that you have empathy for. And now we are about to hear when the first definite verbal incident will occur. So tell us about this.
So it started pretty suddenly. And I know this is common. A lot of victims experience this where during the courtship, like they're displaying their best selves and might be charming and friendly and seem like they care for you and put you first. But then as soon as you're married and you kind of seal the deal, is oftentimes when the abuse will start. So for me, that was very much the case that our first abusive incident was on the honeymoon. And it was, the first time we're spending time together. We went for a week vacation, honeymoon to Hawaii. And kind of all week, there was this contention that was building up between us that I wouldn't call abuse, but there was this constant critiquing of me where it was disguised as him wanting to help me with self-improvement, which I'm all for self-improvement, but he just kept critiquing things. And so our first verbal incident was based on the fact that I was cold all week and wanted to wear a sweater and should not have to be put in a position where I have to fight for my right to wear a sweater. Seems quite silly. But he said I was weak and that I needed to self-improve myself so that I would not be affected by the cold. So I've been hearing these comments all week. And then finally, at the end of the week, it was actually my birthday. And on that day, everything kind of came to a head. And he just went off on me on this issue about how I was not open to self-improvement and I was not open to hearing his advice for me and that he was disappointed in me. And so just kind of the buildup all week, I just got to this point of emotionally bursting into tears. And then he said he was trying to comfort me and calm me down. And he hugged me in this way that was very disarming. It was not tender. It was not loving. I wouldn't necessarily call it physical abuse yet, but it was just a way of rattling my senses and me not feeling comfortable in my body or in my skin. I didn't think he was going to try to hurt me, but the whole situation just left me completely confused. And that was really the first step at my unraveling. And so that sense of confusion, things not being logical, trying to understand him, that disconnect building between us is kind of what set the stage. And then the first physical incident of abuse happened 2 months later, where it's the same situation of him trying to hug me, but this time he was crushing me and I was feeling suffocated. I couldn't breathe. And then he was holding my arms with his fingers and left like finger marks in me because of how much pressure he was generating. And so I once again was like, can you see this? Can you see this is not a hug? This doesn't feel good. I'm still trying to be logical and rational with him and trying to explain that this isn't okay. But I'm still not labeling it as abuse. It took me many years before I was able to do that. I'm labeling it as me being confused and not understanding what's happening or what's going on. I'm still seeing it as every marriage, every partnership, things are going to come up. I'm still trying to get to know this person, right? And maybe there's just a lot about him that I don't know yet. And I have to be patient. I have to be understanding. So I'm kind of constantly putting things on me to understand him to figure him out, to be patient with him. And then kind of the pattern that we fell into is that there were these abusive incidences that would happen, but they were spaced a couple months apart. And so that left me in this period of like constant place of just thinking, oh, that's in the past. We've moved through that. A couple good months have gone by. That's not going to happen again. And then when it would happen again, I would be disarmed and confused and trying to figure things out. And I would try to point out to him, this is exactly like what happened 3 months ago or 4 months ago. And then trying to be logical and rational once again. And he would just say, you are just unable to let things go. You keep living in the past. And so he would keep disarming me that way. And then as that abusive incident continued, the verbal abuse, he would start swearing, hurling insults at me. There wasn't necessarily a trigger. It would just come out of nowhere and just seem like he just decided that day he wanted to bring me down. So that's how the verbal abuse kept growing. And then with the physical abuse, what I would say started to happen with the pattern is, and it's hard to describe, but he would start coming at me like from the other end of the room or whatever as he's walking towards me. He would have like this twisted smile on his face. And it was like he knew he was coming after his prey and he was going to enjoy this and he was going to derive pleasure from this. And that's when I kind of started to see him in this different light of like something else is going on here that's really weird and I don't understand it and it's not right. But I'm starting to see there's a pattern, even though I'm not calling it abuse. And most of those times, I wasn't physically necessarily trying to fight back. I was small, 100 pounds at the time I got married. He was twice my size. So I wasn't physically feeling like I would win against him physically by trying to defend myself. But when I did try to do that, he would actually jeer and boast of his strength and tell me, like, you're no match for me. Like, what are you trying to do? And that completely threw me off as well. So I would just say I was in a place of being disarmed and confused, and that was continuing to grow worse.
And as things started to grow worse, how are you feeling about yourself? And do you lose any parts of yourself during this time because you don't want to be on the receiving end of insults or things, even though nothing has to happen for him to insult you or for these things to occur? But are you trying to start to read the room a little bit more than you did before? And are you walking on eggshells as time goes on?
Yeah, absolutely. Walking on eggshells, nervous about his outburst or temper or like what might throw him off. I was very much, just in terms of the cultural stereotypes of Indian women, trying to be the perfect Indian wife. So I was taking care of the home. I was cooking every day. I was always putting his career first before mine. I was putting his family first before mine. A week after our honeymoon was over, his mother moved in with us. And that was just sprung upon me very last minute. She had come from India to America for the wedding. So I knew she was going to be here for a couple months. And I knew she was going to come to visit us, but I thought she was going to be staying with his sister most of the time. So as soon as we got back from the honeymoon, he sprung it on me and he just said, my mom would really like to come see us. Are you okay with that? And I didn't feel like I could say no. And so it was just a very awkward situation, but it felt like it was the first time where I was losing my voice. He made this whole big speech about how we should come first and our families come second, and this whole big spiel about prioritizing us in the marriage. But that was really because he saw I was very close to my family and he wanted to distance me from my family. But that was not true when it came to his family. So I was starting to see these like contradictory things playing out that were not making sense to me, really. So I will share a little passage from my book about that experience and how I was still not labeling it that way, but I'll read you this short little passage here. It says, it was obvious we lived in two different realities. He evidently lived in a narcissistic world where he was always right, where his own needs had to be met and mine did not exist, where his authority and power over me could not be questioned. He always justified his anger that defied logic. And I lived in a world where I kept rationalizing events, letting go of the past, and practicing forgiveness. I still believed a relationship was a 50-50 partnership, and I had to do my part at keeping the marriage intact, not acknowledging I had actually been doing 100% of the work. So, this very much describes the divide that keeps growing between us and how I just keep putting more and more on myself. And besides walking on eggshells, I would say the other thing that really started to characterize me at this point, which I think is true of many victims, is I did feel like I was living a dual life. It's one life at home, dealing with the abuser and the reality of like what's unfolding in our marriage, even if I don't understand it yet. And then it's another reality being out in the world, facing our friends or family or whoever, and just kind of starting to pretend that everything's all right. Our marriage is great and we're figuring it out and we're doing well. And so I think that disconnect was not only happening between us in the marriage and in the relationship, but now that disconnect is happening within me also, that I have to have a public persona where if I am traumatized, if I am in pain or whatever, I'm not going to show that to the outside world.
Was there shame attached to it or no?
That's a great question. I know that's a common experience a lot of victims have, is dealing with shame. And for me, it wasn't really shame. It was still confusion and not understanding things and me feeling like I just need to work harder at figuring him out. And this is a problem that is solvable, that is just part of the process that we're going through in our marriage.
So I just want to stop you right here for a moment because sometimes these things were a couple months apart, but sometimes, as I read in your book, there was a lot happening inside some of these months. And there are moments when the abuser was using your car, which was keeping you isolated with no transportation, and you rationalized that as being temporary, that you were saving money. Also, your abuser began criticizing how often you called your family. Isolation starts occurring here. At home, he spent a lot of his time with his mother and not you, and you began feeling like you were a third wheel, and you continue to try to be understanding of this. And also, when the abuser was having career and legal problems, you really heavily became involved in helping him, typing documents, doing research, and handling the household and organizing your life around his schedule. Everything, as I read, was about him. And with disagreements, you learned that disagreeing could bring criticism or insults or rage or withdrawal. And at one point, I read when you were beginning your acupuncture practice, he wanted things to revolve around his schedule. So he just repeatedly told you that you knew nothing about business, so you would switch your schedule. And eventually you did. And the pressure from him stopped when it came to the business after that. And once those things stopped, things started to feel really safe for you. And this becomes a really big survival technique going forward for you, where you start compromising your own beliefs and preferences to end all of the emotional abuse that is going on. So during this time, during these months in between, these big events that are going on, you also start just trying to remove every possible reason he might have to criticize you. So you ran the household and really started thinking that if you could become a better wife, a less emotional person, maybe there would be less anger. And your abuser during this time also learned which parts of your identity mattered enough to hurt you with. And he told you that you are not a true Indian wife, which is something you spent much of your life trying to really preserve, which started to really create doubt in you. And there were also threats of divorce in this time, and you viewed marriage as this lifelong commitment. He was keeping you off balance here with those threats, and he was keeping control on you with those threats because he knew what those threats meant to you. And there was also good periods in here too. So sometimes time did pass without a big incident or without other incidents going on where the abuser was actually, funny and charming and pretty warm, and this was giving you hope. So in this time, you're really learning to anticipate his reactions, suppress your own feelings, really accommodate him in every way, forgive quickly, work harder, search for explanations about things to make your marriage make sense. And by the time physical violence starts to really show up, the conditioning that is going on has already been happening for a very long time. And that brings us here to the next big incident in your story. So what happens from here?
And the turning point for me was really at kind of the 4-year mark where I was finally labeling it as abuse. And what it took was a very severe physical incident of abuse that also came out of nowhere, that it was the most extreme violence I had experienced up until that point. And whatever the conversation was, I don't really remember, but something triggered his anger, his explosiveness. And he started to bang my head against the wooden floor. And he kept doing it repeatedly. And I kept trying to be logical and ask him to stop and say, "You were really injuring me, and this is not okay," up until the point I could talk. And he did that until I was unconscious. And so I had never at this point been beaten to that point of being losing consciousness before. And so that to me was a clear definition of abuse. Everything up until then, the physical things that he did that hurt me, I was just still making excuses for him, saying he didn't mean it or things just got out of control. But that incident really felt like I knew I needed medical help. But because he was a doctor, I felt trapped that I didn't want to go to where he worked and expose him. He was still someone as an immigrant that had come here on a visa and was not a citizen. So for him to be accused of abuse and potentially lose his citizenship, lose his visa status, get deported, put an extra burden on trying to protect him that I wasn't willing to do. And then we were just living in a city where my family was there. It was where I had grown up. Even if I went to a hospital where he did not work, we knew tons of Indian doctors everywhere. And I just felt like to be able to seek medical help would be revealing my secret to everybody. And it just felt like too big a step that I couldn't take at that point. And if I couldn't get medical help in terms of speaking to my family, this happened in their home when they were not home. I just felt like I had spent 4 years living this sham marriage and they knew nothing about it because I had kept a secret. And I didn't feel like I could disappoint them by telling them the truth. And so it kind of, in a way, made me double down, thinking I really need to get other help and we can still fix this problem. So I completely misdiagnosed the situation as something that can be solved, as something that could be fixed. But after that incident, I did decide to reach out to my mother-in-law and the sister-in-law to ask for help because I felt like, well, these are the two people that know him best and that he would listen to and care about him and care about our marriage. And so they seem like the logical choice to go to for help. And the reality is that didn't take us anywhere. They didn't end up saying anything to him or saying much to him. It actually just enabled him more because he felt like now that they knew our secret and they weren't holding him accountable, that he could continue to get away with it. So fast forward a year, and we had our second really big physical incident of abuse that left me unconscious again. And this time we were very isolated, living in a town where we didn't know anyone. He was doing this fellowship training program. So we were just living in this town for a year. And so during that time, during this period of isolation, there literally was nobody to turn to if I needed help. And so the situation that happened in this second big incident is, once again, we're having a conversation, something triggers him, something trivial, and he decides to physically take me and throw me across the room. And there happens to be this full-length mirror there. So I crash into that full-length mirror, broken glass everywhere, and I passed out. I was unconscious. And when I came to, I could just hear him yelling at me to get up and to clean up this mess. And then once again, I'm trying to be logical and rational with him. And I tried to explain to him, do you understand what you've done? And he's like, well, you just tripped and you fell. And I said, no, that's not how physics works. You threw me with a certain force against that mirror that I couldn't have tripped and fallen across the room to that point. And he wouldn't admit it. He wouldn't see what he had done. But now I had like physical gashes in my arm where the glass had cut. I was bleeding. And I'm like, how can you not see this? How can you not see what you've done and like take responsibility for this? But of course, he refused to see that. And this is the point, I think, where I was so disarmed from the situation and so clear it was abuse. If I had been in a situation where I wasn't so isolated, I think I would have gotten out of the house immediately. I think I would have gone to get medical help. I think I would have called people up. I would have definitely tried to do something, but I was isolated once again in a town where I didn't know anybody. And the only couple that we knew in town from his workplace were actually coming over to our house for dinner. And so I tried to get him to cancel and they didn't answer the phone. And so literally after we've cleaned up this mess and I'm put a Band-Aid on my cuts and whatever, the doorbell rings and our dinner guests arrived. And so it forced me to go into the situation of playing this facade again, and I think if it was anyone who had known me, they would have come in and seen like something is not okay. But these people didn't know me. And I had barely met them, did not know them. And so I just acted like the perfect hostess. And the next day I did take off and leave town and went to my parents' home for 2 weeks and just had to try to recover. And I still kept my secret and I didn't tell my family what was going on. But I think that was their first sense of like something's not okay with me, but they couldn't put their finger on it. And there wasn't really like any intervention at that point. But it was really me taking space away from the marriage and space away from the abuser for the first time. And this is at kind of the 5-year mark into our marriage. And so there is another short passage I want to share with you from my book that I think paints this picture well of my cognitive dissonance and all the things I was ignoring and I just mentally were not adding up in my head. So this passage says, "My love blinded me from accepting he never really loved me. I believed he was too selfish and self-absorbed to be capable of caring about anyone else. All these years of deception, I had been a fool to not see the truth. He had never recognized my needs, my dreams, or really anything that was important to me. He could not acknowledge the love I showered on him, my patience, loyalty, or commitment to saving our marriage. He had been blind to my pain, my injuries, my wounds, and all his destructive, violent actions." So this is in hindsight, after I've come out of the abusive marriage, that those ideas were crystallizing. But I think at this point of physically leaving the abuser, getting out of town, taking time for myself, was the first time I was really starting to see the magnitude of the disconnect between us. And maybe this wasn't solvable. So during the 6th year of our marriage, and during this time, I have labeled it as abuse. I do see myself as a victim. I am having severe PTSD symptoms that I can recognize, that feeling emotionally numb or detached, reliving experiences in my mind, palpitations, anxiety, all these classic PTSD type of symptoms. And so at this point in the marriage, in that 6th year, I have labeled it as abuse. And I still am not at the place of deciding to walk away. So I'm feeling like, okay, now that we have a diagnosis for this problem, let's throw everything we've got at it. Talking to the mother-in-law and the sister-in-law, his family did not work. So let's try to expand who we're reaching out to for help. So I had suggested marriage counseling to him a number of times and he had never taken me up on it. But at this point in the 6th year, I'm quite serious that we cannot continue as is and we need help. So he did finally agree when I gave him this ultimatum to do marriage therapy with me. And as I was searching for a counselor, I really wanted to find someone who was trained and understood domestic violence. So the marriage counselor I went to claimed to have that background and to be trained in that. And what was shocking to me is, now we're taking our private world out into the world, meeting somebody, and I was once again innocent or naive or just not understanding the abuser playbook that he's going by. And he paints this story of me of being kind of this control freak who's always like monitoring what he does or what he says and not happy with things. And so he painted this story to the therapist that he was the victim of me being a control freak. And so the therapist's solution to this was to tell me that I had taken his power away and that he needed to feel like he was the king of the castle. And so the homework assignment that she gave us was that for the next 2 weeks, I was going to allow him to take charge and I should comply and do everything that he said to help him feel more confident with having his power back. Of course, everybody knows this is not what a marriage counselor should recommend. And I did go and report her to the state medical board after, feeling like this was egregious, what she had done. The abuse escalated after that, of course, because he just felt more enabled and felt like I was the one in the wrong and that he could do no wrong. And he continued to see her after I stopped the marriage counseling. And so he said that she'd said that nothing I did would ever be good enough for him. So now he's got an ally on his side that is literally destroying any chance we had of not just reconciling the marriage, but just really accounting for what really happened for him to be accountable of that. So, I know for a lot of victims, there might be a traumatic, abusive situation that is kind of the final wake-up call of why they leave their abuser. For me, it should have been at that 4-year mark when I was unconscious and he beat me against the floor. It should have been at that 5-year mark where he threw me into the mirror and I was unconscious. But I just kept persisting of, I am a healer, I'm a fixer, I'm a problem solver. And because that was my identity and how I operated in the world, I just kept thinking this is something that I could fix. So the real deal breaker for me is, during that time of our marriage, we were moving multiple times because of his jobs, trainings, different opportunities that he had where his career was always first. And so we had kind of done our final move, the city that we moved into at that 6-year mark, where we bought our first home. And I kind of thought, okay, now it's my time to focus on my career. I've given 6 years of being patient I was still working most of the time, but, I wasn't able to allow my clinical practice to thrive and to grow. And so the wake-up call for me is when we got to this place where I just got my own office, I was setting it up, I was going to try to put all this energy into it. And he just told me that it was not important for me to work and having a career was really not important for me. And that to me was just a very clear deal breaker because there was no confusion. Up until this point, everything that he did was constantly leading to me being confused and disarmed about things. But my right to work, and for me, my profession is not just a job, it's definitely a calling to be a healer. So it was just black and white, crystal clear to me. Oh, this person doesn't support my dreams and never has. And if he's been saying he supported me up until this time in front of other people, it was just all talk, but it wasn't really supporting me, when it's my time to shine or my time to focus on my career. So that was kind of the big turning point for me where I was like, we're going in different directions. I haven't put my life on hold after 6 years to just be told, give up on all of my dreams and my hopes. And so at that point, we did discuss being separated. We weren't talking about divorce yet, but I was telling him I needed physical separation because I was at kind of my wit's end of the abuse cycle we were in, which, in the beginning of the marriage was every couple months. but now had escalated to being weekly incidences. The frequency had just become unbearable where I couldn't recover. I couldn't get myself back. And so I was just in this perpetual cycle of like, I cannot continue to live like this anymore. So we were physically separated where he left the home, stayed in a hotel. This is when I invited my family to come visit me and finally broke my secret to them and told them about our situation and what was happening. And they were devastated. And I will say, if it wasn't for my family's support, I don't know if I would have been able to do all the things I did to get out of that marriage and to heal and recover afterwards. And this is not common in Indian families. Divorce is still very much a cultural taboo. If you're unhappy in a marriage, the pressure is to still stay in the marriage. And even if you're in an abusive marriage, if you've admitted that to people, there is still pressure to stay in the marriage. And so I was very lucky and fortunate that my parents didn't think that way and didn't have those old-fashioned beliefs and very much wanted to support me and make sure I was safe and healthy and okay. So they didn't initiate thinking about divorce. Their first thing was just me being physically safe and separated and all of those things. But if it hadn't been for that support from them, which I'm so grateful for, it's very rare in my culture. I don't think I would have been able to take the next steps as easily as I did. So for me, when I finally made that decision to file for divorce, I knew this was, a cultural taboo, but I felt like I had the support of my family, felt like we were at the point of irreconcilable differences where he had never, ever admitted to the abuse. And so I just realized if you can't even admit to the problem, there's no way to fix the problem. And so it just was clear that there was no way to fix this. And so at the point that I filed for divorce, this is at the beginning of the 7th year of our marriage. At this point, we only used attorneys for communication. And so we never really spoke to each other again after I made that decision. And so he now started to use his attorney to bully me and intimidate me and just felt like the abuser had a new form to continue and perpetuate the abuse. He also cut me off from my credit cards, all these financial manipulation tactics. And so it just made me even more clear this is not a person who ever cared about my well-being. And so I was starting to get more clarity about understanding him and the disillusion I had had through my marriage where I was disarmed and confused and trying to figure him out. I'm getting more clarity that this is who he really is. There is no deception about this. Like, he is an abuser and he was kind of fitting that profile. So at this point, after I file for divorce, is when I am seeking out help and trying to do this in different ways. And all of these other ways were re-traumatizing in their own way. And I'm sure many victims have similar stories of this. And so I get to this point where I do visit a local domestic violence center. And I think that was the first point I would say feel some shame, where I was just like, I can't believe it's come to this. I can't believe I am actually a victim of domestic violence. And I am now walking into a center to get help. So I think that was probably the first time I experienced that kind of feeling. And I just, once again, was innocent and wasn't expecting to be re-traumatized when I went into this center seeking help. But one of the people helping me was a Christian faith leader. And he just cast a lot of judgment on me, and he reprimanded me for not doing premarital counseling. And I was kind of shocked by that. And I said, I've never heard of premarital counseling. That's not something that's part of my culture or my belief system. And even if people do premarital counseling, that doesn't protect you from abuse. An abuser can still be an abuser regardless of whatever premarital counseling you might do. So I was just kind of shocked at his ignorance and that he would interact with me in that way when I'm so vulnerable and seeking help. And especially because this was, my first interaction with someone at a local center. So after that, I started going to some support groups at that same center, and it was helpful, I think, hearing other women that are victims and hearing their stories and what they had been through, and it just made me feel for the first time I'm not alone. Because up until now, I had been so extremely isolated that I didn't have any reference point of this happening to other people or talking to other victims or survivors or anyone I could relate to. But what did throw me off in those support groups is I felt like I couldn't completely relate to these women because when it was my turn to talk, instead of talking about my abuser, I started sharing stories about the mother in law or the sister in law and how they were enabling the abuse. And the audience that I was with, none of them were really cognizant of living in multi generational homes or these cultural nuances or even the fact that abuse in these situations might be occurring by other family members as well. So it's not just that the abuser is maybe enabled in that system, but other family members of his could also be actively participating in the abuse as well, which did happen to me with the mother in law and sister in law, honestly, taking his sides in things. Or when I turned to them for help, his sister in law once said, Anisha, you have to look at your actions because he's told me in these incidences, you are the one who might be taking that first step of being violent, which completely shocked me. It started to make me understand the stories that he was fabricating and how he was trying to get sympathy and, support from them. And so after kind of being frustrated or disappointed at this local center I was going to, I realized that I really needed cultural support and I needed to be finding people in my community, in the Indian community, to see if I could get more support, in that kind of a system. And so there was no Indian women's domestic violence organization in the city where I lived. And at the time, there were only about 20 or so organizations like that across the country, so not even in every state. And so I actually drove 4 hours to another city to go attend this event with this Indian women's group, focusing on domestic violence. And I was quite surprised to not get the support I was looking for in this environment either and feeling re-traumatized once again. So I had staff, as I was opening up and talking to some people one-on-one, I had staff members say things to me like, I'm not their typical victim because I can speak English well, because I am a citizen, because I am well educated, because I am employed. And so it just revealed to me that the victim community that they were dealing with was mostly immigrant Indian women who were on visas, who were unemployed, who couldn't speak English well. I heard comments from staff members like, well, this only happens to Indian girls in India or in villages. I even had one person tell me, well, oh, if your abuser was a doctor, then I'm sure the physical abuse wasn't that bad. And it just completely floored me. I'm like, these people have no idea what they're talking about and how much this is traumatizing me to hear this. And so as I became aware of a lot of these misperceptions and myths about abuse, even within my own community, this is kind of one of the first seeds that was planted to inspire me to write a book down the road, that I wanted to dispel these myths and I wanted people to see there's a common denominator of abuse throughout all these stories, regardless of where you've raised, what language you speak, your socioeconomic background, your religious beliefs, that abuse is abuse no matter what. And even in our own Indian community, it still plays out in all these different ways, even if it's a love marriage, even if it's a arranged marriage, if it's an introduced marriage, abuse is still abuse, regardless of those variables. So the next part of my story is, I have filed for divorce. We're separated during this last year. I'm seeking out all these different ways to get help. And it had never come up for me before to file a restraining order because I had worked so hard to protect this man who was an immigrant, who had a visa, who could be deported, who could lose his medical license, who could lose his job. And so, as long as I was a wife committed to being married, my goal was still to protect him, even after I had identified it as abuse and even after it got really bad. And so At some point, I decide that I do want to file for a restraining order. I think this was the same day or the next day after I filed for divorce that I don't need to protect this man anymore. I do want to protect myself. So as I'm preparing for this hearing with the judge, I went through my old journals and started to look at all of these abusive incidences that I had journaled about and, written about over the years. I'd never gone back and read all my journals during that time that I was married before to see the pattern. But I actually ended up documenting 42 abusive incidences from the beginning of the marriage to this point of filing for a divorce. And then it just becomes crystal clear to me the pattern of abuse that I have been trapped in, that I kept not seeing the pattern because he kept disarming me and I kept staying in this perpetual state of confusion. So I did file for a temporary restraining order. And when I did have to go into the courtroom for the permanent restraining order, we were in there all day, and I will say that the judge was extremely patient with me and really let me tell my story. And then I really thought I was gonna have a positive outcome with this, but at the end, I lost that battle for the restraining order because she said, "I believe you that you are a victim of domestic violence, but there are no police reports. There are no medical records. You have absolutely no evidence besides your journal entries that you are a victim of abuse." And it was really in that moment I realized how much I had done to protect my abuser and how much I had not protected myself, that disparity. And so I did lose that battle, but it was a defining moment for me in my journey. And the way I describe it in my book is I just wanted to get down on my hands and knees and scream and cry and let out all this emotion. But I just felt like at that moment is when I wanted to become an advocate for victims and survivors of domestic violence because I thought I was able to come and try to fight for myself. But there are so many women who never have a voice, who never even get the courage to file for a restraining order, who don't live to tell their story. And so, even though I lost that battle in the courtroom, in many ways, I think it was a very empowering moment for me to decide I'm going to fight. And not just for myself, but I want to be able to fight for other women as well. So, a lot of healing was definitely necessary, but I think as a victim, when you're in the thick of things, and you're in survival mode, you just don't really have the time to tend to yourself and to get the healing that you need. So one of the things that was a game changer for me was a book a friend recommended by Lundy Bancroft called Why Does He Do That? And as I read this book, I was just shocked and it felt like this man had a video camera in my house and was describing the abuser's personality and his deception, and it really just made me understand the abuser's playbook, that it doesn't matter who the abuser is or what their background is, there is like a script they are following for all their intimidation tactics, their manipulation tactics, how to have control and power over you. And so all the confusion I felt all those years in my marriage where things weren't adding up and I couldn't understand his behavior, this one book just made everything crystal clear. It was just a huge wake-up call for me. So this book I read before I filed for divorce, but in the time we were separated, I devoured this book and then I really started to understand the depth of being a victim for myself. And then I just started to read and devour as much information as I could about abuse, but I found so much of it was books written by men or therapists, no like cultural books that explained my predicament as an Indian woman. And so that was also another seed, I would say, that fueled me to want to write my own book and answer these questions is I wanted to hear from victims. And I wanted to, as a survivor, have other women be able to hear my voice, not just coming from a therapist or, a third party involved in this. So as I was seeking out my own healing, one of the biggest things that really helped me heal was acupuncture. As an acupuncturist, I ironically am someone who specializes in treating trauma in my patient population. It's PTSD, anxiety, all these different symptoms. And so it's ironic it took me so long to identify myself as a PTSD victim. But I knew at this point of healing that this is what I really need. And so I did seek out a local acupuncturist and got her help. And so what I found, that really, and I know most victims don't necessarily all have the awareness about integrative medicine modalities, know which therapies to seek out, might not have the financial resources to do so. So I definitely was privileged that I knew this is what's going to help me and that I can afford this. And so the acupuncturist that I visited, I told her exactly which points to needle and how to help me. And what I felt is that all the adrenaline that was trapped in my system with my PTSD would just flood out. And I would have this incredible release. And I would just feel these moments of clarity that helped me start to take the next steps. So I was doing this in the 7th year when we were separated. And then when we were going through the divorce process, where I was just kind of seeking out these therapies. So acupuncture was really key to get rid of the adrenaline and just start to think clearly about next steps and how to help myself and what I needed to do to heal. So it wasn't one treatment. It was definitely a series of treatments over a period of time that helped me finally get out of that adrenaline high that I was in and so used to living in, walking on eggshells as a victim. The other thing that really helped me in my healing journey was finally getting a good therapist. I was traumatized after the marriage counselor we went to. I was too scared to try to find another therapist for a long time after that. And then I had a friend who was seeing a therapist and she highly recommended her. She was long distance in another state, but I just said, okay, I'm going to give it a try. And this therapist was actually a survivor of domestic violence herself. So I felt confident that she would understand me and be able to help me. And so my first conversation with her is actually before I filed for divorce. We were separated, but I was still questioning, can this marriage be fixed? And so the therapist said one sentence that really changed my life and made me wake up from the delusion I was living in through this whole marriage of, I can fix this, I can save this. So the one sentence that she said to me that gave me pause was, Anisha, what evidence do you have that this man can change? And it just shocked me because I had never thought about it that way. And as I thought about it, I said, I only have evidence that he is going to perpetuate his behavior and he's going to continue to be an abuser. But it was really one of the first moments that I felt like I had to face reality and I had to really see who he was. And it made me understand as an abuser that our arrangement was working out great for him. He was getting everything that he wanted. All of his needs were being met. And it made me really see the difference between his position and my position. So fast forward through this period of separation, I finally got my divorce in the fall of 2008. And this is pretty close to the 7-year mark of our marriage. We had gotten married in December of 2001. So now in the aftermath, I think a lot of people have this misperception as a society, oh, the victim's out. Now her life must be so much better, or we just snap out of it and things become great. Of course, it is a difference of night and day not being with your abuser and being out of that cycle of violence. But the aftermath was really challenging. I was now forced to not only try to focus on my healing, the legal battle is exhausting and just re-victimizes you all over again. But now I'm also trying to make my career work and pay the bills and financially survive and pushing myself. And there was a period of a year or so where I was working 3 jobs at the time, working at different clinics, just trying to make ends meet. And, I'd work these 3 jobs and then I would come home at night and I was putting together the rough draft of my book because I felt like the writing was so cathartic to me to really be able to put all these pieces of the puzzle together, and not just for myself at this point, but now I'm committed to trying to share this story with other people and help other victims who are living in a state of confusion understand their predicament and hopefully get out faster than I did. I definitely regret I stayed in that marriage for 7 years. I wish it had been just 7 weeks or 7 months and not taken such a toll on me. But after the actual divorce, I think it was in 2 years of just struggling financially and struggling with my healing and still not feeling whole, and still not feeling like I've recovered from this. So after those 2 years, I actually did move back into my parents' house. I decided it was like the final push for the book. I wanted to be able to write full time and be able to publish the book the next year. So finally in 2012 is when I was able to publish my book, The Power to Break Free. And I wrote a companion trauma workbook as well to help women process their trauma and heal. And I found for most women, it's really after they leave their abuser, you don't really have the luxury of healing while you're still in it. It's in the aftermath. And the longer that aftermath is, the more clarity you have, the more tools you get, the more your confidence builds, and you get equipped with that. So also in 2012, I got a fabulous job. I was financially doing really well, feeling like I was really putting a lot of the stuff in my past behind me. And now I could really focus on myself and my career and, just found a lot of ways to shine and thrive during this time period. So the next steps for me is I started a nonprofit that has the same name as my book, The Power to Break Free Foundation. And I just wanted to be able to do public speaking and go to events, share my story. I wanted to be able to do this in the Indian community and get rid of the misperceptions that exist in my community. And I also wanted to go to other DV organizations and talk about just being culturally sensitive to the victims that are coming in your door and how there are different nuances with those cultures that we have to take into account of what is maybe keeping a woman trapped that you might not be culturally aware of. So I know for many survivors, after you get out of your abusive relationships, you don't want to look back and you don't want to relive your trauma. And I completely 100% understand that. For me, I felt like my own healing was being able to share my story and being able to give a voice for all the women who don't have that chance to have a voice and don't survive after their traumatic relationships. So that was definitely a big part of my journey, is being able to carry this mission forward. So one thing I'd like to just share to, all the victims and survivors out there is that healing comes in many shapes and forms. Having your family support, friend support, cultural support, society support, all of those things are helpful. Going to your local, whatever the local resources might be in your town, domestic violence centers and therapy, all of those things are important. But I think a big part of healing that's kind of often overlooked and isn't promoted or endorsed at these local domestic violence centers is integrative medicine modalities. And by that, I mean the things I've trained in with my background. Acupuncture is amazing at helping to reset our nervous system and can just provide so much healing that we don't even really realize that we need. It's not just that adrenaline from that fight or flight cycle of violence that we're experiencing, but many victims can have long-term consequences of how it affects your sleep, your energy, your mood, your digestion, so many other things can go haywire in our systems as a consequence of the physical violence. So I already shared before how helpful acupuncture was for me in my own healing, but I also wanted to pass that forward. So at my local center, DV Center, I created a free clinic for 1 year where I offered community acupuncture, where about a dozen women or so could come, receive acupuncture at the same time, and build a little community support amongst themselves. But what was amazing to see is week after week, these women would come back and share their stories of their symptoms getting better, getting more clarity, being able to process their abuse better. So that was just really wonderful to see how to pass that forward and to share that as a resource at that local domestic violence center. My dream is that every domestic violence center across the country will have these resources available for women readily or partner with local acupuncturists to offer that. But I think a lot of work needs to be done to make centers aware about these resources and how to use that. So, in addition to the acupuncture, some of the other healing modalities I use, I'm a longtime meditation instructor and have practiced meditation since I was a teenager. So, being able to offer meditation classes at a center like this, I think would be so invaluable. And it's something in my own clinical practice as I've worked with victims and survivors. I've always taught different meditation techniques of how to be aware of bodily sensations and traumas and be able to heal that through our meditation practices. I am also a yoga teacher, and there is a lot of trauma-based yoga teachers now that are doing this in communities and seeing people with all sorts of trauma, not necessarily just domestic violence. But I would love to see trauma-informed yoga teachers at every domestic violence center, just teaching women how to be comfortable in your body again and how to heal from physical violence and how to have touch that is supportive and comfortable. So all of these things were just really helpful resources for myself. But once again, I knew about these resources because of my own background and training, and most victims don't know about these resources, and most centers are not educating women about these resources. So yeah, so I think just the encouragement I would give women in your aftermath of healing is take advantage of as many resources as you can, because the healing process, there's always more to heal. There's always more to uncover. It definitely takes time. And so for me, I started to see month by month after my divorce how much better I was feeling. And then I just started to see year after year, I was getting my old self back, my confidence back, my energy back, and felt like enough time has passed now that I can look back at those 7 years as the dark cloud in my life. But I was able to have that power to break free when so many women don't. But that's kind of the baton that I want to pass to other women, is that I really believe every woman has the right to live a life of dignity, free of violence, and find her freedom. And we need to just help support that with as many women as we possibly can. And all of the people that helped me in my journey, my therapist, family, friends, I feel like there is no way to ever repay people for all the support that they gave me. And the only way to do that is to keep paying that forward.
Well, Anisha, I really want to thank you for being here with us today and not just sharing your story that will help so many people, but your knowledge of abuse, discussing the second abuses you had to deal with, the retraumatization, and also all the details of your healing process. Sometimes we do not cover that enough in our show. So I really just want to thank you, just for doing that. And your website is Power to Break Free, and I'll put that link in our show notes. It's powertobreakfree.com, and everything can be found on your website. And just a really big thank you for being here with us today and sharing your story and just sharing all of your knowledge today.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I want to thank you for just creating this place to have these important conversations. I love the work that you're doing and sharing, and the community that you've built with this. So thank you so much for being dedicated to the cause and having these important conversations.
Well, thank you once again, Anisha, for being here. And if you want to be a guest like Anisha is today, please do go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, fill out our guest form, and we'll go from there. We also have a support group at our website with Zoom meetings every Wednesday nights, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights. And we have a newsletter at our website. And with our newsletter, you get a free reflection workbook from every new survivor story. And that is a weekly newsletter, all at narcissistapocalypse.com. And that is it for today's survivor story. So for myself and Anisha, we hope you have a good night.